All right. Okay. So thank you, Professor Pong, very much for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts and insights on doing a systematic literature review. Uh, I will start off. I will share my screen so you can have a look at my slides. Thoughts and insights on doing a systematic literature review. I will start off. I will share my screen. Is the sound clear? All right. I hope you all can hear me clearly. If you are not able to hear me, just if someone could leave a message so I could, so that I know. Okay, I guess the sound is clear. All right, so let me begin the presentation now. So what I have done here is compressed a really large webinar series that I ran earlier into 2 hours or less than 2 hours for this session. So the idea is what I want to do is to explain you what is systematic literature review, what are the main things that you need to study or know about when you're doing a systematic review, and what are the steps and what is it that normally top journals will look for when you're submitting a systematic review for a systematic literature review paper for review. So I have divided this agenda, this program, or this session into 3 broad topics. One is I will give you a broad introduction of systematic literature review, or SLR. Next, I will talk about Prisma, which is a methodology for doing systematic literature reviews. And then I will take you through few case studies to show you from real papers how researchers apply systematic literature review in their papers. Before we begin, I would like to give you a little bit information about myself. You might have already heard about me from Pong, but I'd like to give you a little bit more information. So one thing I would like to start off by showing my Google Scholar profile is that if you look at some of the top papers that have received very high citations for my papers, those papers are literature review papers. So one of the very important or useful reason for doing a literature review is it helps you to build your citations very fast. So you can follow me on my Google Scholar page to see all my other publications. I'm also active on LinkedIn. So all of you who are listening to this session today, I would appreciate if you could connect with me, add me to your LinkedIn network, and then because I share a lot of useful content there. What I have also done is I have set up an online research community on my website, vidypotdar.com. I strongly recommend all of you to join this vibrant community. We have a lot of researchers from all around the world who are very active and engaging. And basically the idea behind setting up this community was to share my experience with all of you, with researchers, young researchers, or early career researchers who have a lot of questions about research. So do that, do register for that. I also have a YouTube channel where I regularly share videos on Ph.D. and on doing research. So have a look at that as well. There are well over 40 or 45 videos up there. To connect with researchers, I also have created a Telegram and a WhatsApp research group. So I'll share these links with you to join the group. I think it will be very useful for me to remain connected with you. So these are the two WhatsApp groups. Specifically, I have made it for you all. So please join. And I'll share these links later on. Okay, so let's begin with the introduction, the first part of the systematic literature review for today's session. So whenever we start thinking about literature review or a systematic literature review, the first thing is, what is a systematic literature review? A systematic literature review, as the word tells, it is a very systematic and a methodical way of doing literature review. Systematic literature reviews began in the medicine or medical research area, and it has since been adopted in a number of different research disciplines, research areas. So a systematic literature review is a very methodical and a step-by-step approach for conducting literature review. It is useful for anyone who is either starting their research or their Ph.D. or MPhil or are established researchers. And it gives the basic important information about how to do a systematic review of literature. Next thing I want to talk about is when to do a systematic literature review. I think systematic literature review in itself is a very detailed research activity. It is a methodology in itself. It is a methodology for doing research in a way that covers all aspects of the literature. So it is not being done randomly based upon what you think you should include in the literature. It actually follows a very detailed and a step-by-step process, and I will explain that in today's session. So to answer when to do a systematic review, the first answer is if you are starting off your PhD. Yeah, if you are or your master's by research or MPhil degree, the first thing I think you should do is to do a systematic literature review. The benefit of doing a systematic literature review at the beginning of your research is it allows you to look for all the available literature in a very methodical way, in a step-by-step way, so that you do not miss out on any important research. Because the last thing that you would want is you do a poor or not a very detailed literature review, but then you realize that later down the track in your research or during your PhD that somebody else has actually done what you're trying to do. So to avoid that situation, to avoid that problem, you should do a very thorough literature review at the beginning. And doing it via a systematic literature review approach is the best way. Why is a systematic literature review important? So I would say there are many reasons why a systematic review is important. First of all, it is important because it gives you the confidence that you have looked for all the relevant literature that is out there in the area that you are going to study. It also helps you to kind of identify potential research questions for your study, for your research. It is also important because when you want to publish your literature review, if you have followed a systematic review methodology, many of the top journals would like that, and they would appreciate, and the chances of your paper being accepted in a good journal increases significantly. So these are some of the reasons why doing a systematic review is important. So one thing that many researchers ask me is, then how is a systematic review or a SLR different from the traditional literature review that we do? So on that aspect, fundamentally there are many differences on how between systematic review and a traditional review. So I've made a table here to show you this difference. Okay. So first of all, on the left side, if you see in the first column, the first cell is the need. What is the need? So when you are doing a systematic review, you are actually trying to find an answer to a specific question. That is the fundamental reason for doing a systematic literature review. However, in traditional reviews, that is a part of a larger empirical study that you are doing, or you include a traditional review in a research article that you're going to publish with your empirical results or empirical findings. So that is the first difference. The second difference is research protocol. So a research protocol is required in a systematic review, but in traditional reviews, it may or may not be necessary. So normally it is not reported in traditional reviews. The third is research selection process. So how do you select which papers to review? In a systematic review, there is a process and that you have to follow. Whereas in a traditional review, it depends upon the author's choice or author's preference on which papers they would want to select and which they do not. Next is evaluation process. So evaluation process refers to how are the articles that you have selected for your review, how are they evaluated? So in a systematic review, there is a defined process on how this is achieved. Whereas in a traditional reviews, there isn't. Similarly, data extraction process, research synthesis, all have a process, a step-by-step guide that you have to follow while doing this. Another major reason is another difference for that matter is that it takes a very long time to do a proper systematic literature review, whereas traditional reviews can be completed in a relatively short period of time. Yeah, so those are some of the major differences between a systematic review and a traditional review. So the next question is how to do a systematic literature review. So basically, there are 3 steps, and these are planning, conducting, and reporting. So in the planning phase, we ask the first very important question is the systematic literature review needed? And this is the first question that you have to ask yourself, because there is no point doing a systematic literature review if there is no need. I mean, if somebody else has already done a systematic review, and you just want to repeat it, there is no point doing that. So find out whether there is a need for doing a systematic review. And if you verify that, yeah, there is a need, then the next step would be to build a review protocol, how we are going to review how the whole systematic literature review process is going to work, And this I will explain in the next section, which is on Prisma methodology. Once the planning is done, we move on to the next phase, which is actually conducting the systematic literature review. And there are 4 steps in this phase. Identification of the relevant literature, evaluation of the literature, extracting relevant information that helps us answer the research question, and then synthesizing the findings from our review. So that is the process of doing the literature, systematic review. And final step is reporting, that is sharing your findings. So you have done a systematic review, you have got your results. Now you need to either write a paper based upon your findings, and then share your findings via a journal. Okay, so that was the basic structure of a systematic, the process of doing a systematic literature review. So now I want to show you what is a typical layout or a structure for a systematic literature review paper. So if you take any good systematic review paper from a good journal, you will find some of these headings that you can see here. You will have an abstract, followed by an introduction, a section on methodology, then results or findings, discussion, limitations and future work, conclusion, and finally references. So this will be the kind of a layout or a structure for a systematic literature review paper. Next, when I talk about the Prisma methodology, you will see how that methodology kind of aligns with these headings. And by following that methodology, it helps us to write a proper systematic literature review paper. So we now move to the second section of this session, which is Introduction to Prisma methodology. All right, so if you see here, I'll make it full screen so that it is easier for you to see. All right, so if you see here, what you can see on the in this table is a Prisma checklist. So this is a checklist. It tells you what all information you need to include in your systematic literature review paper. It is a well-established standard or a methodology that you follow for doing systematic reviews. So in total there are 27 items. So you can see the item numbers, items here, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. So each of the item is what you have to include in your research paper, in your systematic literature review paper. And when you submit a SLR for review, it is advised that you should submit it along with this checklist. And the reason is, if you look at the last column, here you can see you have to mention, or you have to tell which page in your research article, in your systematic review paper, this particular thing is covered. So where is the title covered? Where is the abstract covered? Where is the rationale, objectives, and so on? So you have to mention the page numbers here. So when you submit the paper for review, the reviewers can easily find out where the relevant information is, and they can read that specific information. Okay, so if you look at this paper layout, you would be able to see the headings that kind of align. So abstract, there is a section for abstract in the checklist, introduction, methods or methodology. If we move on to the next slide, you can see section for results, so which is here. Section on discussion. Discussion includes limitations and conclusions, and so on. So basically, all these headings that I have shown you here are listed in the Prisma guidelines, and it is the best way to build your systematic literature review paper. Okay, so let's move on. I will now explain each of the items. So in terms of the first thing, the first is the title. So if you are writing a systematic literature review paper, the title should mention that it is a systematic literature review. Okay, or if you are doing a meta-analysis, then you have to mention that as well. So whenever you find a systematic literature review paper, you will see that in the title it mentions that name, that phrase. Okay, the next item is abstract. And abstract is probably the most important part of your literature review paper. Abstract and introduction. So I always say that you have to spend the same amount of time that you take to write your entire paper on writing your introduction and abstract. So if you spend, just imagine you spend 10 hours to write the entire paper or 20 hours to write the entire paper, you have to spend the same amount of time to write the introduction. And the reason why I say that is when your paper is submitted for review, first thing is you have to ensure that you do not get a desk reject, which means your paper is rejected without being reviewed. And many a times it happens because the editors will look at your abstract, look at the introduction, and after reading that information, if they are not interested or not excited to read the rest of the paper, it is very likely that your paper will not be reviewed. So spend a lot of time writing a proper abstract and an introduction. Okay, so when you think about writing the abstract, there are certain things that you have to mention. If you miss out on at least any one of those things, your abstract is incomplete. And I have seen on many occasions the abstract just does not follow these guidelines. So in this slide, you can see what are the headings or what content you should include in your abstract, and write at least one sentence for each of these headings. So background and objectives, data sources, eligibility criteria, participants, study, appraisal and synthesis methods, results, limitations, conclusions, and if you have a systematic review registration number. I will show you later in the case studies how these how good papers actually incorporate all these in their research, in their abstract. So remember that this is the minimum you should have in an abstract. And when you're thinking of writing an abstract, remember that you always have word restrictions on abstract. So all this information needs to be covered within 150 or 200 or 250 words of abstract that most journals have. Next, let's talk about the rationale. So rationale refers to why is it that you are doing the systematic literature review. I mentioned early on that you have to clearly explain the need for doing a systematic review. So in this, in the rationale, you have to describe the review in the context of what is already known, define the importance of the review question. So by answering this review question, who will benefit and what is the level of benefit? Clearly state what the review aims are, and discuss how the limitations of existing reviews may be overcome by doing this review. So basically here you are giving a justification or a reasoning as to why this review that you are doing is important and why it should be published. Objectives. Provide an explicit statement of questions being addressed. I will show you in the examples later how research questions are clearly defined early on in the introduction section itself to clarify the contribution or the innovation of this of the literature review paper. So let's talk a little bit about framing research questions. So the way you ask the research question defines how simple or how complex your systematic review is going to be. All right, so let's look at this question, an example question. So what do we know about something, XYZ? To answer this question, you will have so much literature that is available that you will be kind of lost in what to select and what not to select. Compared to if you do a little bit more of a focused question, like what can cause an increase or decrease in the possibility of something. So that kind of reduces your research scope and the resulting papers that you would be shortlisting for answering that question. So this is an example of how questions should be framed properly. I'll show you a few examples now. So here you can see I have taken an example from a research paper where they have clearly mentioned their objectives. We aim to identify the level of adherence towards e-health among vulnerable groups. To this end, we do a systematic literature review and meta-analysis. Second, we aim to establish how different design and implementation characteristics influence the level of adherence. They also mention the benefits. Identifying potentially successful designs for e-health can help include these tools as a regular part of healthcare service delivery. So this is a very good example to start off with. What is the objective of your research and what are the benefits of doing this research? Okay, I have got a few more research question examples here from different research papers. And all the papers that I am referring in this presentation are all open access papers. So you can easily access these papers even if you do not have subscription to specific databases. So that is one thing that I have ensured here so that everyone has access to whatever I am teaching here. So let's look at this question. The aim of this paper is exploring and understanding how design can contribute towards a CE transition through the adoption of DFX approaches. So you will not know what these terms mean, but when you read the paper, you will know what those terms are. Another research talks about this paper aims to examine the current advances in thermoplastic recycling processes via additive manufacturing technologies. So this kind of a research question is you will find quite a lot in a number of systematic review papers, where they want to find out what has happened in the research area for a specific topic. Okay, so that is here. And similarly, another research question here. This paper aims to develop a systematic review on graduate employability. So the aim is to find out the progress on graduate employability and competence development, intending to present an international perspective on this matter. So that is the objective of or the research question from this paper. All right. The next bit is protocol and registration. So protocol refers to the objectives, pre-specifies the objectives and methods for doing the SLR, indicate if a review protocol exists and where to find it. And this is very common in medical research, where the systematic literature reviews, before starting the literature reviews, this information is published, that a group of researchers are working on finding an answer to this research question. And this is useful because a lot of people can then learn that, okay, somebody is already doing it, there is no point to replicate that research. The next is registration. Registration of a systematic review, typically with a protocol and registration number, is not yet common, but it is getting more and more popular. It is getting there. It is not there yet fully, but researchers have started doing it. And it reduces the risk of multiple reviews addressing the same question. Like I mentioned, that to ensure that the protocol the systematic review is not replicated, you can register that online. The next thing in a systematic literature review is look at the eligibility criteria. So what do we mean by eligibility criteria? So in simple words, it means what is included and what is excluded in our research. So basically defining the scope of the works that we are going to do as part of this review. So what as part of this, what we need to do is to set some boundaries on what is included and what is excluded. So example could be, we will only include papers that are published between 2010 to 2020. So that is the inclusion criteria. Another example is, we would only select journal articles that are published in Q1 and Q2 ranked journals. Okay, so that could be another inclusion criteria. What is the exclusion criteria? Exclusion criteria refers to an example like, from the journals that we have selected, we will only choose papers that are empirical studies. We will not select reviews. We will not select case studies. We will not select conceptual papers. So that becomes an exclusion criteria. So inclusion states what papers will be selected, what type of papers will be selected, like journal papers. And exclusion explains or defines what kind of studies we will include, or we will what type of studies we will exclude. So that happens in the eligibility criteria. We will see examples of this in the next section. So if you see here, this gives you an example of an inclusion exclusion criteria. we included studies that examined the use of something, those that were published in peer-reviewed journals after 2007, focused on people aged 18 years or older, and so on. So that becomes the inclusion criteria. What is the exclusion criteria? We excluded studies with a qualitative design, research design, case studies, opinion papers, literature reviews, or theoretical reviews. So this is an example of a exclusion criteria. Next, we talk about information sources, which means where we are getting the information for our research, for our paper. So we have to describe all the information sources in the search, which databases you have used, what was the date and the coverage, when was the search done, what date, because all this thing helps other researchers to replicate your study if they want to. You can also report who developed and conducted the search. So normally, if there are say 3 or 4 researchers in a team, then you can say what everyone did. So that is very important in a systematic review. Report any supplementary approaches to identify studies. For example, did you manually look for any other papers by looking at the reference lists of the papers that you have selected? So let me show you an example here. Sorry, I don't have an example for that, but I think in the next section we have some examples. The next point is point 8, which is on search. Here we present the full electronic search strategy for at least one major database that we have used. So if it is Web of Science or Scopus or any other database that we are using or that we have used, we should show the exact search string that we used for searching the papers. Searches can be complicated and iterative, but the objective is to address either a broad topic or a very new or narrow topic. One thing you can also do is to report if these search strategies were peer reviewed. And what that means is if you identify a specific keyword or a set of keywords that you want to use for your research, and you combine them in a specific way to generate a search string, take that search string to an expert in your field and get their opinion. Ask them to have a look at the search string and see if there is anything they think could be improved, or if there is anything missing. Just get a second opinion before you begin your search. Okay, so let's have a look at this example. It's a very simple example, but it shows the process followed for selecting the papers. So the initial search was with these terms that got 384 articles. Next was the screening. Look at the abstract and the title, and you read the numbers that reduced from 384 to 238 because some papers were not relevant and they were excluded. Literature content analysis was done, and then it comes down to 192. So that is the final sample that was selected in this paper. So search strategy, an example here you can see. We conducted an electronic search in the following databases. So these were the different databases that were used. It shows the year 17 to 18. And it also mentions that we used a Prisma flowchart to present the search strategy. So that is an example of how you can write the search strategy section in your paper. This is the Prisma flowchart. Study selection is the next step, next part in the Prisma checklist. And here you state the process of selecting studies. So how you are screening the papers, what basically whatever you have listed in your research protocol, the inclusion exclusion criteria, you are now applying that inclusion exclusion criteria to your study to get to decide which papers to select and which papers to exclude. And once this is done, this study selection is shown using a Prisma flowchart that I showed you just now. Data collection. This is the most important part because here you have to describe how you collected information from the paper. And in your research protocol, you need to mention what information you are going to gather from every study. So if you have selected empirical research papers for your SLR, you have to kind of make a list of items that you're going to extract from each paper. And if some information is not reported in the paper, for example, sample size is not reported, or the participant selection process is not mentioned, you have to show or mention in your paper what did you do for such papers. One thing that you can do is connect or email the authors of that paper requesting that information and include that in your paper. Because not reporting some information because it is not mentioned in the paper is not considered a good, acceptable research practice. And it also introduces bias in your research. So we want to avoid that. Data items, like I mentioned just now, it is what information are you going to answer, what information you are going to extract from each paper. Risk of bias in individual studies. So one thing here you can do, basically when we are doing a systematic review, what we're trying to achieve is remove bias at each and every step of the research. Okay, so when we mention the inclusion and the exclusion criteria, what we are doing, we are unbiasedly selecting papers because we are trying to remove bias at that stage. We are saying that we will only select top ranked journals, and that way we have removed any question or any bias on that aspect. So every step that we take in the Prisma checklist or the Prisma methodology helps us to remove or reduce bias in our studies, so that there are no questions later on that your study was not genuine or not reliable. Okay, items 13 to 16, they form a part of a different or maybe a very detailed research, which is on meta-analysis. And I'm not covering that in this session because that is altogether a very detailed topic, which I could probably speak at another webinar. But if you're interested, you can definitely look at that paper. It will give you a lot of information if you want to go in more detail there. I'll skip a few slides because I look at the time, we are running out of time. But these are some other points or the other items from the Prisma checklist, which you have to include in your research, in your paper. So I'll skip through them now, but I will discuss them in the case studies because you can really see the examples there. All right. Once you have done or completed the literature, followed the protocol and selected the papers that you are going to review, the next important step is how to critique research articles, because you don't want your paper to be a summary, but instead it has to be a critical evaluation of the literature. So doing a critical review of a literature is a very complex process and a very time-consuming process. But if you follow the steps that I mentioned now, it will make it easier for you. All right. So if you when you are critiquing a research article, basically you have to look at every aspect of that paper and then give your critical evaluation. So it could be the title of the paper. For example, does the title clearly indicate what the research is about? If not, you have an option to recommend. You have the option to criticize on that. Then looking at the keywords, are they informative, and whether they are relevant. If you look at the abstract, these are some of the questions that you should ask yourself. Does it explain the purpose of the paper? Does it explain why the research was carried out? What was accomplished? What were the main findings? What is the significance? And what are the conclusions? So if you look at or if you recall, I mentioned early on that abstract is the most important part of your research, and I gave you some headings under which you should write your abstract. So having that makes a big difference, because imagine another researcher criticizing or writing a critical review of your paper. If you have not covered the abstract in proper detail, you will not be able to give them that. You will actually give them the opportunity to criticize your work. But if it is well written in detail, you make your position much stronger. Now, when you're reading the introduction, again, these are some of the questions or items that you can think of. Does the introduction orient the reader to the study by giving a firm sense of what was done in the study, giving or introducing the question or the problem, giving a background, stating the purpose and the rationale of the research? So every element of a research paper has to be investigated, has to be evaluated when you are writing a critical summary. In case of for example, in introduction, you can ask some questions like these. Is the research question or problem researchable? That is the first thing I think you would want to ask, because selecting a question that is not researchable just raises question of why you want to do that research, or how you will achieve what you want to achieve. Is the problem important enough to justify the research? is the background of the research relevant to the research question? Many a times I see papers that have that are very weak in the introduction section, because they kind of just create the background from some of the other papers that they may have already written, and they are trying to recycle or reuse that content. But it is obvious on most occasions when you have done that. When you look at the literature review part, you have to see, does the literature review give a overview of the available literature? Does it look at the similarities and differences between the literature, the strengths and limitations, and how the current study that you are doing fits in the overall framework of this research? What gap does it fill? So these are the things that you have to look for when you are writing or criticizing a research article. So you can continue, you can do this for the whole of the paper. I mean, each and every section you can criticize. So you can criticize the aim of the paper, the research design that they have implemented or used, by asking these questions. By this, because this gives you the opportunity to look at these papers from a very structured point of view. Looking at data analysis or results and findings. Again, a lot of questions that you can ask, and the answers to these questions will help you to frame a critique for a particular research paper. And if you do this process properly, it will help you to make your paper much more stronger, because what will happen is when you critique somebody else's work, you are kind of picking up on a lot of things that they have either done not very properly or very poorly. So by doing that, by experiencing that, you are kind of building a skill that when you write your paper, you do not make those mistakes. Okay. Similarly, the discussion section and the conclusion section, you can make some critiques as well. Okay, so this section itself is quite a long or a detailed or a thorough section. I don't have enough time to go through this part in detail, but for a literature review, or while doing a systematic literature review, the critique is one of the most important elements of the paper. Once you have crossed the hurdle of abstract and introduction, and you have caught the attention of the reviewer, the next thing would be to make sure that the actual synthesis of research is equally thorough, and follow these questions to help you write that. One thing that probably coming to your mind right now is, if I'm going to write a systematic literature review, I have seen a lot of papers where you only, because if they're selecting a large number of papers in the systematic review, you can only write very limited information for each paper. So the critique for each paper has to be very concise and to the point. So if you try to follow all these questions that I have given you as an ideas, it may not be suitable for a systematic literature review, but it will be very helpful if you're doing your PhD thesis or your dissertation. But what that means is, when you are trying to compress that information in a very concise format, you have to pick up the most relevant aspects of the critique that you have written and include that in the SLR paper. Okay, now this is the interesting part of this session, because now I will show you examples of research papers and point out whatever we have learned so far in the session today. Okay, so let's begin with the first case study. So for this, I have selected this paper. The title is "The Policies of Provision of Assistive and Welfare Technology, a Literature Review." In this paper, I will outline, or I will show you 4 things: research questions, how they have written the section that shows the need for doing a SLR, the methodology, and their research synthesis. All right, so if you look at here, the need for doing a literature review, what they have mentioned here is, to the best of our knowledge, few studies have been conducted in the field of health policies, such as this. We strive to obtain a deeper understanding of the process in determining, providing, and implementing these topics by reviewing the scientific literature. So that sentence here gives the background or the justification for doing this research. Here they have shown the methodology, similar to the Prisma approach, a flowchart of how they have conducted their research or designed their research. Some eligibility criteria are mentioned here. Paper should be written in English, should be published between 2000 and 2018, should be peer reviewed, and so on. And in the findings section, they have these 6 headings here: policy, assessment, procurement, technology, environment, and usability. So they have used these 6 headings as their concepts for grouping the literature or categorizing the literature on the specific topic that they are investigating. And this is the synthesis of their research. Let's move to the next case study. This is a paper on blockchain applications in the biomedical domain. And from this paper, I will talk about these 5 things: their research question, the need, their methodology. Oh, sorry, I repeated the research questions twice, and knowledge map. All right, so if you look at the abstract here, it clearly states the paper presents a scoping review of the scientific literature to map the current research area of blockchain application in biomedical domain. So that is their main objective. If you look at the structure of this paper, the table of contents for that matter, they have a section on introduction, methodology or methods, results, discussion, conclusion. And within the methods, you can see these points, which are the ones that are mentioned in the Prisma guidelines. This section talks about the need for doing a literature review paper. A recent critical review of blockchain applications identified major application areas like financial services, healthcare, and so on. An overview of blockchain potential and example application healthcare are presented in these 3 papers, 7 to 9. In this paper, we systematically analyze the state of art in blockchain applications in biomedical domain as presented in the peer-reviewed scientific literature. So that is their justification of why they are doing this research. And this is a flow chart that shows their research process. So they selected papers from number of different databases, how they applied their criteria, and finally got the papers that they included in this review. What are their research questions? If you look at that, what areas have been addressed in the current applications of blockchain? What is the level of project maturity? What types of biomedical data are considered for biomedical applications using blockchain? What are the major reasons for using blockchain? And which blockchain technology frameworks are used in the biomedical applications? So this gives you an idea of the kind of research questions that you can think for your studies as well. In this one, based upon their research, they have come up with a knowledge map. Basically, a knowledge map is categorizing literature in some headings or some categories. Yeah, for example, reasons for doing blockchain, blockchain technology platforms, maturity of blockchain approaches, biomedical data or what type of data is being considered or covered, what are the application areas. So identifying these different use categories of literature is a very complex process, but this is something that you will learn as you read more and more papers. So what I tell my students is when you are reading a research paper, start kind of thinking how that paper, where would it fit? You know, maybe just make some virtual categories that, okay, this paper will fit in category A, this will fit in category B, and so on. So by doing that, you kind of start creating or coming up with these broad areas. And as you read more and more papers, you can then refine this list till you reach a kind of a final knowledge map. And this knowledge map is very useful outcome of your systematic review. All right, let's move on to the third example, third case study. And in this paper, I'll talk about the questions. I'll show you the research questions, the methodology, and the research categories, or how they have categorized the research into different categories. So firstly, the research question is clearly mentioned in the abstract, and that is very important because by reading the abstract, I would want to know what is the main objective of this paper. So they have done that very clearly here. Now let's look at a section of this paper and see what they have done here. So let's start at the very top. Research question. So the area of investigation didn't focus on the specific context, either this or this, looking at the entire extant literature with circular design through adoption of DFX approaches. the keywords, now they are mentioning the keywords, circular economy and its main synonym, end of life, is used. And you can see here a very nice way that they have mentioned as suggested by a recent systematic review on this topic. So looking at existing reviews also gives you ideas for keywords or the synonyms of the keywords that you can use. So these keywords were combined with some other keywords and they were searched. So where were they searched? They were searched in these databases, Scopus and Science Direct. How many results did they get? They got 402 from Scopus, 339 from Science Direct. When they had to refine or evaluate papers, whether to include or exclude, where did they choose the information from? So they looked at the titles, abstracts, and keywords. They removed the redundancies. And they got 125 documents. So similar papers that were reported in both, they were removed and they got 125. A first analysis of titles, abstract and keyword led to a set of 43 documents. So from 400 to 339 to 125 to 43. Yeah. So see how they have kind of reduced the scope or reduced the papers. Then reading the entire manuscript conducted to a final amount of 31 documents. So in this paper, they are going to review 31 papers, 31 research articles. The next paragraph continues and then talks more about the selection process. Authors selected only those documents contributing to a real enhancement of DFX approaches and so on. Figure 1 shows the research strategy used. I think I have the figure in the next slide. Search strings. Table 1 reports the 4 search strings. Additional papers. Okay. Last 15 more documents were recommended by experts to be added to the list. So what you see here is there is some form of peer review that is happening. I mentioned earlier on that you can do peer review of your keywords or search strings. And you can also do peer review of papers, which means you can ask experts, are there any papers that we have missed in our selection? And if so, you could include those papers. So here they have done that. So this is a good example. Next point is managing bias. The entire process of selection was conducted by 2 authors, carrying out autonomously to not create any bias. The results were compared and made consistent to each other, leading to the research presented in this paper. Research categories. All papers have been categorized by nation of the first author, year, and so on. Okay, so this table here now shows what keywords they searched. For example, design guideline and circular economy. For this particular keyword, they got 33 results from Scopus, 10 from Science Direct. And the one in the bracket, if I remember correctly, of these 33 papers, 5 were selected. Similarly, you can see other keywords and a table of this format. So this is an example of a table that you can also include in your SLR, in your research paper. So when you're reading other research articles, also keep an eye of what they report in their findings section, and if that is something that you can apply for your study as well. This one shows their process of research. So again, the same thing that was there in the excuse me, in the table. This one is shown here in a flowchart. In this article, they have also shown the studies where the studies were done, so the countries, and where the papers were published. So some quantitative information you can include as well. Next, coming to the knowledge map, or categorizing the research literature. Here they have got 6 categories. So circular design improvement, and circular design metrics, and so on. They have got the research papers, relevant research papers under this category. And this table kind of gives a breakdown or a structured evaluation of each of these studies based upon their research type. So whether there was a theoretical assessment, was it a case study, was there an action research that was done, and so on. So again, something that you can apply in your paper as well. So this slide now shows all the 6 categories, 5 categories. They have the literature is grouped into 5 categories here, and how many papers are in each category, the number is listed, and they have also listed the citation for each of these, each of the paper in each of these categories. This shows the graphical way of representing the same information. All right, so this section, or this content here, is the literature analysis or synthesis. So like I said earlier, when you are writing a systematic literature review, you have very limited space on what is it that you can include. So finding out the most relevant or the most important thing to report in the paper or in the synthesis is, I think, is a strategy that you can take for writing up the paper. Yeah. So let's see an example here of how they have done this. As reported in table 2, the most common purpose justifying the adoption of DFX to foster and address circularity is the improvement of the design, product, services from a circular perspective. So these are some of the studies that are addressing this. Baker explored how product design can be proactively address product life extension and product life recycling. So that is only 2 or 3 lines for one paper. Based on the waste framework directive, they selected 3 main strategies for product life extension, in order to address one of these three strategies, it is important to realize how to define product lifespan from an environmental and economic perspective. So here you can see some, not criticism, I would say, but some suggestion. The challenge is to determine when to apply which product lifecycle extension. For this reason, they proposed a methodology to determine the optimal product lifespan. So when I read this part of the summary or evaluation of the literature, they have selected a few items. So firstly, they have said what is the contribution, what they have done, what framework or methodology they have used. So they have used the waste framework directive, and what was the problem that they were addressing and how they have solved that problem. So those four items are kind of covered in this explanation or in this summary. But what is kind of missing is, so what? The question, so what? What is the limitations of this research? How could it be further improved? That critical evaluation was missing. Let's look at another example from the same paper. So here they have taken this paper, explored how this approach evolved, grouping the design approaches into 4 innovative levels. So these are some of the levels they've mentioned. Similarly, another study, in the PSS context, researchers consider environmental and economic approaches and also included the social aspect. Another study, again a small summary. So what I want to say here is when you have very limited space available to kind of cover the literature in your systematic review, find out the most relevant and impactful point that you want to convey to researchers, to the readers, and include that. Okay, so I'll not go through all of this. So there are quite a few examples that I have included here. All right, I will go through one more paper, and then I think I can conclude the presentation, and I will take on questions. Okay, so this paper is from marketing area, and the topic is sustainable fashion. So in this paper, if you see, they have used an approach given by Dainer and Pilbeam on conducting systematic review. So Prisma, like I mentioned, is one approach. There are many other approaches like that. And in this paper, it is using an approach that is presented by Dainer. And it has 8 steps: developing a protocol, conducting a search, screening titles and abstracts, developing a selection criteria, evaluating results, extracting and synthesizing information, reporting, and so on. So even if you look at these elements, these points that are mentioned here versus what we discussed in Prisma, they're more or less similar. So it is I would say it is a variation of Prisma. Actually, I have not read that paper, so I don't really know whether that is based on Prisma or some other approach. But basically, that is a method that is being followed in this paper. This shows the process of paper selection. So in this paper, they have selected 465 articles for synthesis. So it's a very large collection. What I liked about this paper is they have represented or shown a number of shown the information or synthesis using tables, and that is very helpful for readers to evaluate. So this table is about inclusion and exclusion criteria, and you can see the way they have mentioned the inclusion criteria, exclusion criteria, and the topic, so the subject. From the subject point of view, what was included, what was excluded, and they also gave a justification. So look at if you look at this is a good example of what you can also apply in your paper. Similarly, access, whether can access the full text or cannot access full text, and so on. In their findings, so here you can kind of see the approach that they have taken is synthesizing information from a number of resources, from a number of studies. Yeah, so they start off with starting that sustainable fashion started to appear in the management literature around 2008 with the works done by these researchers. However, more than 10 years on, an agreed upon definition of sustainable fashion is still not there, and so on. This paper forwards the view of sustainable fashion, includes the variety of means by which fashion items or behavior could be perceived to be more sustainable, and so on. So they have got some nice explanation and description here of the literature. Another table on terminology. So if your paper if you have to cover some topics or some definitions, this is a good way that you can represent that in your paper. This slide shows their, I would say, a kind of a knowledge map, not really a knowledge map, but a framework on how they have categorized the literature. And the size of the bubble reflects the size of the number of papers. If you see, this is the biggest bubble, 130 papers. This is the smallest bubble, 12 papers. They have created a framework here to categorize the literature in different quadrants. So if it applies in your study or in your research, you can follow something similar. Based upon that figure, they have this table. You can see these bubbles or the topics on the left. What was the research characteristics, their focus, and the key papers on that topic. Another way of representing information, this table now shows their research methodology. In this category of pragmatic change, there were these many different papers. The methodologies used in these papers. So there were 46 papers that were qualitative, 26 quantitative, 7 were mixed, and so on. Again, a very important, interesting way to give you a snapshot of the information of the research methodologies used by different studies. These are some of their findings. So what are the key characteristics that lead to purchase intention? So you can see here and the relevant reference papers here. They've also done a table for future research. And one of the things in systematic literature review is the section on future work. The reason why people read a systematic literature review article is because they want to find out what are the areas for future research. So if you write a systematic literature review paper that does not have a very thorough, detailed section on future work, that becomes one of the big weaknesses of your research, of your paper. I mean, I have written papers like this where the future work section is itself like 25-30% of my paper, because that is what readers are coming there for. So you create a knowledge map, for example, or a framework to categorize the literature, and use those similar headings to show the future work potential under each of those areas. That is an approach that I take very often when I write my papers. I think I've covered this. Okay, so this is all that I wanted to cover in today's session, because it is this whole topic of systematic review is quite an extensive topic. I mean, there's only so much that I could cover in a 2-hour session. But I think I've given you enough information to kind of get you started with doing a systematic literature review paper. Like I said, I have done a very extensive webinar, a 5-series webinar on this topic. I suggest you have a look at that, because I talk about all these things in a lot more detail there. So this was kind of a trailer for what I've covered in the webinar. So yeah, I think I will stop here, and I can take questions now. So, all right. So I can see some questions that have come to me from YouTube directly. So I will take those to begin with. And if Hong, maybe you can copy those questions that you may have on Teams, put it on YouTube, then I can answer them easily here. So there's one question: how this knowledge map can be built through NVivo or Atlas or these kind of softwares. So I think this knowledge map can be built using many different types of softwares. I kind of use a mind mapping tool to help me build the knowledge map. But you can even use it. You can use Word, or you can even use Visio or any other tool, because it is just a graphical representation. So you don't really need any sophisticated softwares for doing that. Next question is, how long can a SLR paper be, or what is the average number of pages for a good SLR paper? All right, so the answer will kind of depend on which journal that you are submitting, because every journal has a page limit or a word limit on how many papers, how many pages they can accept. So that is one way to look at it. Another thing is look at the papers that are published in your discipline, that are published in a Q1 ranked journal. That will give you some idea on how long the papers are. But a reasonable paper should at least be 10 to 12 pages long. And since it's a review paper, I would say at least 10,000 to 12,000 words in the paper. So that is just a rough idea, but you can compare that with the papers published in your discipline. I'm just looking at the questions, if there are any more questions. So hello, hi Pong.
Yeah, that are the questions that I posted just now on the YouTube chat. And another question is, the first question was the differences between SLR and meta-analysis study.
Yeah, so I think I will, to answer that question, I think you first need to understand the meta-analysis first. And because I have not covered that in this session, so I will not, I'll skip that question for now. But meta-analysis is more of a quantitative evaluation of the literature. And maybe I do another sessions focused on meta-analysis, and then that will make that that thing very clear. Okay, if there are any more questions, please let me know, or otherwise we can finish the session. And if you have any questions in the future, you can always post it on YouTube. This video is recorded. It will be available on my channel. So you can always, log in to my channel and always find all the past streams. I would also suggest you look at the other seminar that I've done, 5 series webinar on systematic literature reviews, and to see if there are any questions, to basically learn. And if you follow that webinar series, you would be able to write your own review paper, because I give you step-by-step guidelines on how to achieve, how to write the paper there. And if you would like to contact me after this session, just feel free to email me. I'm copying the email address here. Okay, there's one more question. How to write one's article research limitations when the limitations are not mentioned in the article? Should we view from reader's point or analysis from researcher themselves? Okay, so basically, not all papers would mention the limitations in their article. So in that case, the best option is, as a researcher, you are aware of that area, you know the discipline, you know the topic very well. So you would have to figure out what are the limitations of that study in itself. So it is your own inference after reading the paper. I can give you an example. Say if one of the paper that you are reading, it's an empirical paper, and in their data collection, they fail to mention how they recruited their participants. Okay, they said that they have 200 participants for this study. The participants completed the survey and so on, but they did not mention how the participants were selected. So that is a weakness of the paper, because this is a very important information. We need to know who these participants are and whether these participants are really relevant to the research question that is being asked. So if the research is about say agriculture, for example, and you are interviewing or sending the questionnaire to technology people, that does not make sense. So that is a weakness of the study. So you could include that as an example of the limitation.
So is there any question? Prof, I'm waiting for the question if they have any.
Okay, we can wait.
One more last question.
Any more questions from the participant? If no, then we shall end this. Any more last question? Any last questions from the participant?
Prof, I think there's no more question from our side here.
Okay.
That will be the last question from Judy. From Judy Tay, the last question.
Yeah.
Right. Let me see. Maybe some come in. Yeah, there was the last question. Okay, there was the last question, Prof. So, thank you very much. Okay, it's a very informative sharing from Dr. Vidy. Right, I'm sure that all the participants are beneficial from today's live webinar, steps in conducting SLR. So on behalf of the Center of Business and Management, we would like to thank Dr. Vidy again for your valuable insights. So thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Dr. Vidy. Goodbye and take care, everyone.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks for your time, Dr. Vidy.
All right. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.